Right. Well, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Racism and Gay Men of Color, Living and Coping with Discrimination. My name is Michael Kwag. My pronouns are he and him, and I am an uninvited settler from a Korean family who immigrated to Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in the lands now known as Vancouver over 40 years ago. I'm now privileged to live and work in Treaty 13 in Takarano on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We at CBRC are blessed to be able to live and work across Turtle Island, and I welcome you all to drop in the comment box a note about where you are calling from for today's webinar. As the Director of Knowledge Exchange and Policy Development at CBRC and the Gay Men of Color and the facilitator for today's webinar, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's discussion on racism in the gay community and Dr. Sulaimon Giwa's newest book, Racism and Gay Men of Color, Living and Coping with Discrimination. I'm thrilled that we're able to take part in this conversation today with Dr. Giwa himself, as well as Robert Alsberry from the BGMN, the Black Gay Men's Network of Ontario, to explore and reflect on the experience of racism within gay men's communities, including how we're living, coping, and responding to racism in our social, sexual, and structural environment. Before I introduce them, I just want to make a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on CBRC's website and YouTube channel. I'd also like to encourage everyone to post their comments and questions into the chat box or via the Q&A feature throughout the discussion today. We are really hoping to have a dynamic and interactive conversation, including with those of you in the audience. So we'll do our best to monitor the chat, integrate any reflections or questions that might be coming through. Lastly, please do your part to ensure that today's event and discussion is safe, respectful, and inclusive of everyone. Inappropriate comments or questions that reinforce racist, ableist, transphobic, homophobic, or xenophobic discrimination will not be tolerated. We do recognize that the topic of today's session may be difficult for some people. So we definitely encourage you to practice self-care, which may include just taking a break or stepping out from the session if needed. And with those housekeeping comments out of the way, I would like to introduce my panelists for today's webinar. First, we have Dr. Sulaimon Giwa, who is an assistant professor and associate dean of undergraduate programs and social work at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. He's also the endowed chair in criminology and criminal justice at St. Thomas University. He is the author and co-editor of several books, including Racism and Gay Men of Color, Living and Coping with Discrimination. Also, Acceptance, Stories at the Center of Us, Afrocentric Social Work, and HIV, Sex, and Sexuality in Later Life. Dr. Giwa is also associate editor of the journal Psychology and Sexuality and is an editorial board member for the Canadian Journal of Human Sexuality. Welcome, Dr. Giwa. Our second panelist is Robert Alsberry, who is a Black American living in Canada whose professional work has focused on applying a health equity lens to Black, LGBTQ+ and HIV issues. This includes his present role as a trans clinic registered nurse at the Centertown Community Health Center in Ottawa and the Keeping It 100 coordinator for Max Ottawa, a peer discussion group for Black, LGBTQ+ masked folks, and a committee member of the Black Gay Men's Network of Ontario, in addition to being a KD board member. Welcome to you both, Robert and Dr. Giwa. To get us started for discussion, for today's discussion, Dr. Giwa, I was kind of hoping that you could start us off with a reading from your book.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Michael, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for making time to be part of this event today. It's a privilege and an honor. I'm currently at the moment based in Ottawa, Gatineau. So thank you very much for doing the land acknowledgement that you did, Michael. Despite the fact that in the banner it shows Memorial University, I'm currently away from St. John's at the moment. So the passage that I'm going to be reading is actually from the introduction of the book. And I think it sets a good tone for the conversation we'll be having later today, and also speaks to why I undertook this particular work and why I think it's important. So it goes something like this. The continuing omission of the narratives of gay men of color is not innocuous. It fits the broader white romanticism of racism as a high historical phenomenon. This book's focus on the narratives of gay men of color provides a counter story to the dominant stock stories propagated about race and racism in gay men's communities. Confronting the normality of these stock stories decenters whiteness, revealing and underlining racist ideology and amounting to an act of resistance to a hegemonic system of white supremacy. Whiteness can be understood as a set of assumptions, beliefs, and practices that place the interests and perspectives of white people at the center of what is considered normal and everyday. And that's a quote from Gilbert. The term connects with white supremacy, which in CRT parlance denotes the subtle and penetrating force of power exerted in everyday actions and practices that shape opportunities and chances for white people. Enabling the expression of subjugated knowledge or truths often denied to gay men of color about their experience of racial discrimination shows how racism continues to be a problem in contemporary life and gay culture. The centrality of experiential knowledge contained in narratives such as those in the study on which this book is based provides a foundation from which dominant stock stories can be contested. It offers an irrefutable account of the lived experiences of gay men of color, a reality that racially conscious and unconscious white gay men may choose to ignore or be slow to understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giwa, for sharing that passage from the opening of your book. As a gay man of color myself, I think I definitely sort of relate to that struggle of getting recognition and validation for experiences of discrimination, and at times feeling at the margins of queer community. So thank you for that, sharing that opening. Dr. Giwa, your book draws into focus the unique experiences of gay men of color, specifically in Ottawa. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you had decided to base your research in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, Michael. Thanks for asking that. Yes, the book is based in Ottawa, and I think at the time when I was collecting the data, one of the things that I was noticing in the literature was really a key absence of a discussion and a focus on the experiences of gay men of color in Ottawa. At the time, I wasn't really sure why there was such a gap in terms of, researchers not necessarily focusing attention on that particular population. I don't know if it had anything to do with the fact that Ottawa is mostly seen as a government town, and therefore this might actually make it difficult to be able to recruit and do the kind of research that needed to be done. But as somebody who was living in Ottawa at the time, still I am, and went to school here, worked in the community, I felt that it was really, really important to begin to change the narrative, the national narrative around the experiences of gay men of color that we are talking about. Most of the literature often tended, and I would even argue still continue to largely focus on the major metropolises. So by that, I'm referring to Toronto, I'm referring to Montreal, and I'm also referring to Vancouver. And I think that obviously there are advantages to that kind of a focus, but also I think that there are limitations to those focus, particularly in terms of trying to understand the nuances and the specific type of experiences that are being experienced by gay men of color across the country. And I think when we only focus on those three metropolises and we're extrapolating data from those places, I think we miss those nuances. So really my effort here was to try to begin to intervene into the larger conversation to be able to introduce a new perspective, new insight and ideas and experiences from gay men of color that hopefully would also inform the larger conversation that we're having, particularly around the discussion of racism in the gay men's community.
Mm. Yeah, I think what you're saying about the predominant focus or dialogue around the experiences of the queer community in general, and just a focus on Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, and the need to center other experiences in other regions, in other cities, is a really important part of the conversation that needs to be had. So thank you for speaking to that. I was also wondering if you might be able to speak to the title of the book, and specifically the focus on gay men of color.
Yeah, so yeah, this is another one that required a bit of a thinking in terms of just the title itself. I'm aware that folks might be asking the question about how come I didn't use the language of racialized men rather than gay men of color. And one of the initial thinking that went into the idea of using gay men of color instead is because when I set out to do the research, I was obviously being informed and guided by my own lived experience as a racialized or Black gay man of color in the LGBTQ plus community. And I wanted that to kind of inform and to direct me in terms of the kind of language that I was using and how my research will be taken up within the community. I particularly knew from the outset that Indigenous or Two-Spirit individuals would not necessarily be part of the study, because again, that's not really the lived experience from which I'm coming from. And I wanted to make sure that, and I'm sure there are other researchers and academics who have been more capable and better positioned to be able to do that kind of research than I am. So I really didn't want to take up space where I didn't feel like I have enough expertise and knowledge to be able to speak to. And for me, this kind of landed me into the space of gay men of color. But at the same time, when I wanted to talk about gay men of color, I also wanted to, really focus on, Black gay men here. I wanted to focus on Middle Eastern Arab men. I wanted to focus on South Asian and also East Asian men. Those were the predominant groups that were at the time of the study, were the largest group in Ottawa. So I really wanted to tap into into those populations. And by using gay men of color, it allows me to then be able to also recognize the limitations of this study in terms of me not focusing on two-spirited individuals, as I already alluded to for the reasons why I didn't do it. So that's really where the idea for gay men of color came into play, and yeah, that's really the explanation for why I landed on that particular topic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Giwa. You spoke to a little bit about this in just what you were saying now, in terms of your own experience living, working, going to school in Ottawa, and how that informed the sort of specifics around the scope of your research and the title of the book. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to any other personal and or professional experiences that you may have had as a gay man living in Ottawa, and the specific sort of racialized experiences that led you to write this book.
Absolutely, yeah, I can speak to that. But before I do, there was just something else I wanted to kind of dovetail back onto your second question around the focus of the use of gay men of color, say, for example, as a comparison to racialized gay men. One of the other things that I forgot to mention was that even in the Canadian lexicon of terminologies that we're using to describe these particular groups, my understanding is that even when we're using the word racialized, Indigenous people don't necessarily subscribe to that particular usage because of the fact that they are the original peoples to this land. So they don't necessarily see themselves as being racialized. And if I had used the language of racialized, I didn't want to, again, give the impression that I was being all-encompassing in terms of the population that I was actually including in the study. But gay men of color allows me to be able to specifically name and point to the particular groups that was really the focus of the book. So I just wanted to put that out as well too. In terms of your question around personal professional experiences, I think one of the things that I noticed while I was undertaking this research and even prior to undertaking this research in Ottawa was really just the lack of community space for gay men of color, gay people in general, or even LGBTQ people who identify as being racialized in general to come together and actually have a space for themselves where they can commune, where they can build communities of care for themselves. And even when you think about the larger LGBTQ plus community, there wasn't really opportunity for that kind of inclusion in those spaces as well too. So in a way, we were invisible to the larger LGBT community, and we were also invisible to ourselves as members of those communities in terms of how we take up space or are not allowed to take up space because of, we just didn't have the means to be able to do that. So recognizing that limitations, it also obviously definitely fosters, racial tensions, particularly when you are in LGBTQ plus spaces, which is predominantly white, and you're trying to access some of those resources and be it like, going to the gay clubs, or be it, just having access to men's clothing store, things of that nature that are available to the broader community. But because of the racism that is embedded within the community, makes it really, really difficult for people who are racialized or who identify as being gay men of color to be able to actually find a footing and a holding within those spaces. So those were some of the things that were driving that kind of agenda. But on a personal note, when I moved to Toronto to take up my residency, and even I would argue even prior to my residency, but this particular example of that I had when I was in Toronto doing my residency for my PhD was really, really poignant in terms of just how steeped racism was within the context of LGBTQ plus community. And I think, again, that also propelled the research that I was engaged in. And that experience really had to do with just the way when I went into a restaurant with my partner, the reception that we had received was completely opposite for a couple who were in an interracial relationship, where a lot of the attention seems to be, pivoted towards my white partner, and all the questions around, feeling the sense of welcomeness into the restaurant. Everything just again pointed directly in the direction of my partner. Nothing really in terms of checking up on me, trying to see if I'm feeling comfortable within the space, if they can offer me a drink of water. I think it's really, really difficult to describe the felt experience of racism that people are subjected to just because of the fact that they look different. And it bothers on the point of where you feel a sense of misplacement, that you are in a place where people don't necessarily want you. You feel like maybe you should not be in that space because the reaction and the expression that you're getting from people is one that is suggesting that you don't belong here, right? And then one thing that sort of put salt on the wound was towards the end of the meal. The bill for the meal was then also passed on to my partner, as if to suggest that as a Black man in the restaurant, I wasn't capable of actually paying for the meal that I just consumed. And it just again reinforces this idea of invisibility of myself as a Black person in that space, and that there's a whole set of assumptions that is also roped into that particular treatment that makes it really, really difficult. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that has experienced this. But I think for me, those were some of the realities and everyday experiences that I felt needed to be examined a bit more, because if I'm experiencing it, it's likely that other people who look like me are also experiencing it. And I really wanted to be able to tap into those experiences to then say, beyond just these experiences that we're having as individuals, but also as a collective, what are some of the ways in which we're also coping with those experiences? Because I think we don't want to stay too focused on the piece around victimhood as if to suggest that, gay men of color, when they encounter experiences of racism, they're just mere victims, and they're now reacting, or they're not responding to those experiences. And my research was one way that we can begin to question that narrative of, victimhood, to be able to say, what are some of the ways that gay men of color, when they do encounter racism within LGBTQ plus communities, in this particular case in Ottawa, how do they actually respond to those incidences of racism? So that's really what the book is about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Giwa. I mean, I think what you're speaking to is definitely resonating with me, as a gay man of color. And then just, one of the things that I've been reflecting on listening to you is the trajectory of experiences of this racial discrimination based on our color, the color of our skin, and how that evolves, expands, changes, retracts over the course of our, of our personal development. I sort of think about the experiences of just coming out and trying to make connections with other queer, with other gay men, with the queer community in general, just really struggling to find any footing. And I know this based on my own experience, that of so many of my my peers and my friends, that there's this feeling of when you're first sort of entering into the gay community as a person of color, as a gay man of color, there's a sense that you sort of need to pick one. You can't really be both, and being both poses, it disrupts things, and people let you know that you're disrupting their normative ideas of, who you are relationally, how you're supposed to show up in the world. And I think the example that you speak to in just sort of going to a restaurant with, with your white partner, and just how filtered the experience can be as a person of color, and how different that can be for the non-person of color in that situation. And I think we actually, all three of us might be able to relate to that, as having dated, being in relationships with gay men who are not of color, who are white. And I'd love to actually now pivot to you, Robert. And I've known you for several years now, and it's been wonderful getting to know you since you moved to Ottawa. I'm wondering if you might be able to just speak to some of your own experiences moving to Canada, settling in Ottawa specifically. In what ways does your experience in Ottawa differ or relate to your experiences elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Michael. And I do want to acknowledge how grateful I am to Dr. Giwa for writing this book. It's definitely a labor of love. It was very refreshing to read. And part of the narrative for me was, I know how to be Black and gay in America, and particularly from Pittsburgh, where I'm from. But even in the 6 years that I've lived in Canada, I'm still figuring out how to be Black and gay in this country, particularly in this city. And I've known Dr. Giwa as well. I met him actually right when I moved to Ottawa, when he did an initial presentation with his initial research findings. So to come full circle to reading this book, it felt very personal. I wish I would have had this 6 years ago, but it's able to put a language and a feeling to exactly that, to what it's like being a gay queer man living in Ottawa without having to, compare experiences from Toronto and Montreal, which are great cities, but I don't live there. And they're, and Ottawa has its own uniqueness. So, so in reading it, it just felt very personal of, being able to connect to the places that were prescribed, the particular language that's prescribed as well. And also breaking down the nuances, right, of, in this Venn diagram of racism, depending on what we look like, right, there's specific peculiarities, right, and distinctness to those experiences that we're having. But I also appreciate about the book as well of, I identify as Black, so certainly that personally resonated with me, but being able to read about experiences from my Asian counterparts, from Middle Eastern era counterparts, what's similar, what's different, was also very enlightening. Yeah, and certainly, when I moved here, I was overwhelmed. I didn't have language, and it's actually because of Dr. Giwa's work that was part of the catalyst for me starting and still running, keeping it 100. I hope people who are familiar and know me, connect me to that group in terms of having a space specifically for Black mass folks to be able to talk amongst each other, share our own health and wellness tips amongst each other. And part of it was, this need for space, because it, just looking at the larger canvas of Ottawa, it's really white. And it's very difficult to see yourself heard, to see yourself represented.
Thank you, Robert. I know that you and Dr. Giwa have collaborated on some local events, discussing his new book, and engaging guys locally on the book, but also, more broadly, experiences of racism among gay men of color. I imagine, there's been some opportunity to have further conversations with gay men in the community about, about this book, about this broader issue of racism and how that can impact uniquely the experiences of gay men of color. So for both of you, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the response to the book, some of the conversations that you've had with folks in Ottawa, and whoever wants to go first, please go ahead.
Do you want to go first, Robert?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So Dr. Giwa and I last weekend had the pleasure of being on Chill FM here in Ottawa, which is a Black on Black radio station. And then we had 2 in-person events, one Saturday that we had designed to be with racialized folks exclusively, and then a larger one on Sunday, which included our community members. So I think the weather, which was beautiful, took some heat away from wanting to congregate in person. So Sunday was a bit better attended than Saturday. But in the discussions, I think for me, and I'm certainly curious to hear what Dr. Giwa has to say in response as well, I think what really resonated is, I think where we're at in talking about racism is, it's such a general thing. We talk about it, but we don't really look at coping strategies. We don't look at recommendations, how to make it better, personalizing it, and moving past the conversation of racism as either, wearing a white hood and or being mean, right? I think particularly for a lot of white folks, right? Like, part of being called racist, why that's so triggering and causes such emotional responses for white people, is they don't want to be seen as a bad person, right? Instead of talking about it in a systemic, oppressed way. And there's folks who benefit from it, and there's folks who do not, regardless of how well-meaning or nice that we can be. So I think what really resonated for me in reflecting on the conversations that we had at the book launches is that it really gave a catalyst to move into those deeper conversations of what change could look like, listening to some of the racialized folks and having a validation of their feelings. And I think that's very, people don't always get an opportunity to express that in a way where they're heard, right? And in a way that doesn't, I think one of the things white supremacy has done is, particularly as racialized folks, is we tend to walk on eggshells, right? Because we want to be honest and speak our truth, but we know that sometimes the reaction can be negative or overwhelming. So we balance, we all do that code switching in some type of way. So to have a space to speak truth and it being met with honesty and with the understanding of what it's really like, and then what that looks like in a coping strategy area, and how we can make things better, I think was really refreshing. And certainly for the larger session that we had, we had a lot of white gay men on Sunday, I think really spoke to that too, because then they got a chance to unleash some of their honest feelings without being seen as being a bad person, right? Sometimes the acknowledging racism, sometimes in and of itself, can be so overwhelming that it doesn't lead to productive conversations.
Thanks for that, Robert. I think that was really eloquently stated. And I will agree very much with all of the sentiments that you've articulated. I think also just to build on that, for me, I also felt that the Sunday event was rich in terms of the conversation and the questions that people had. It was rich in the sense that there was an acknowledgement of the continuing need for affinity communities or groups. So spaces where racialized gay men, Middle Eastern Arab men, South Asian men, East Asian men can actually come together and commune with one another and build a community of care for themselves. I think that there's still that pressing, continuing need for that space to be there. And I'm appreciative of the fact that K1, as an example, continues to still be a space where Black and Black queer gay men can go and have a space for themselves and build community. I think also too, there was conversation that we had around the importance of the research moving away from a focus on deficit to also tapping into some of the strengths that are embedded within these communities. That a lot of the focus that we've seen, particularly when we think about some of the funding opportunities and researchers who are getting grants to be able to do research, a lot of the focus of the research seems to be really, really focused on HIV/AIDS. Which is an important topic for us to be looking at, because again, even the populations that I'm interested in looking at are also overrepresented in terms of people who have HIV/AIDS or who have acquired HIV/AIDS. So I think that focus is important, but I think what people were also saying is that there's a need to move beyond that, or to build on that, so that we're actually, when we're talking about gay men of color, when we're talking about racialized men, we're talking in a sense that is holistic, not just piece and part of gay men of color. Here, focusing mainly on HIV/AIDS, but looking holistically at their all experiences of, what it means to be a gay man of color. What does it mean to be a South Asian man living in Ottawa? Beyond just the fact that, you may be having sex and you may be at risk for HIV/AIDS. So I think that there was that part, and also there was implications and suggestions and recommendations for service providers who are working in those spaces to ensure that they're actually, taking a holistic perspective to their work with gay men of color. And then there was this kind of engagement, organic kind of engagement with the different coping styles that came out from the research, which obviously I'll be happy to provide a high level kind of overview when we get to that point. But I just thought that the conversation on Sunday was really, really productive. And there was also even suggestions for possible research that could be done going forward to kind of build on this work, which I also thought was amazing. So, yeah.
That sounds so awesome. Like the reception that you've been getting and the response, I think, really speaks to the importance of just creating space to talking about it. I mean, I think, so much of what I think we're talking about is creating the opportunity to give voice to our experiences. It's funny because I've been involved in gay men's, queer men's health promotion and research for the better part of 2 decades. And, I think I still struggle to find opportunities where I can actually come together with other gay men of color, other queer people who experience racism in even in our own spaces that are supposedly meant for all of us. But we know, or many folks know that there's blind spots. There are gaps to the ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually practiced and felt, especially for folks that are used to kind of just being excluded and used to not having a place to even just give voice to what they've been experiencing. I mean, I think about some of my earliest experiences after coming out, trying to build relationships, even getting involved in community health promotion work. I felt a lot of pressure to overlook or sidestep experiences unique to me as an Asian gay man, as someone who had experienced racism from my peers in the queer community. And I think that's not necessarily stated explicitly, but I think for many of us for whom racism is kind of like an everyday thing, that doesn't stop when we're just talking about the queer community either. I think this book and the conversations that are coming out of the book, I think, are just so important to Robert, when you said sort of catalyzing into these larger conversations to begin imagining what change could look like, and to also validate our feelings and experiences, because we're so used to being gaslit into feeling like, well, you're queer, you're included, right? And I think it's just a reminder of how important this work is and how much more there is still to come. So thank you.
I just want to thank you for that, Michael, too. And you said something that I just wanted to speak to as well. Certainly this book, it's an academic textbook, but acknowledging of how accessible it is as a book. Everyone should read it, particularly if you're working with gay, queer folks. One of the things that I appreciated, and maybe, in putting on an immigrant hat and moving to Canada, is in chapter 4, Dr. Giwa, which he titled Causes and Factors Contributing to Racism in Gay Men's Communities in Ottawa. One of the things that I think that it's done so well is, he looks at multiculturalism in Canada, the issues around it, and how it creates these blind spots, as you mentioned. So getting into the unique factors of why this country, why this city in particular, it's so difficult to have these conversations, and how that flows over into why it's so difficult to be able to create specific spaces, right? Because I've learned a lot about this city and running a Black gay men's group for the last 5 years, right? And certainly, the reaction from, and I don't even want to say just white gay men, but just gay men in particular, of why would you create a group like that? Or why is there a need for a group like that? And or why can't I participate? And for me, I still don't have an exact response, because I'm like, this is 2 hours a month. 2 hours a month. And you have the whole city and both gay bars and, every organization and every poster and every porn movie and every, it's just overwhelming, right? And so it's very difficult to make those points. And I just think Dr. Giwa really speaks so well to the specific issues of why that's the case, as well as the impact of racism on gay men of color. And I know we'll talk more about that, but I can't say enough about the book. But that point in particular really resonates with me.
Thanks for bringing that up, actually. If you don't mind me, Michael, if I have time, maybe I can just speak to that as well.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that point up, Robert, because one of the things that I really wanted to demystify within the within the discourse that we have when we're talking about racism is the centrality of multiculturalism as an ideology that actually frames the conversation that we're having, much in the way that we also see HIV/AIDS being sort of like the entry point through which we talk about racism, right? So we're not really talking about racism. We're still kind of touching it within the conversation of HIV/AIDS as a way to do that. And that's problematic in of itself, right? But I think also to multiculturalism, what it does, it also gives this kind of like, language to people to say, well, look how great we are as a nation, as a country, as a community, and that we're actually, diverse, and we have diverse representations within the community. And because we have that diversity, that negates any subsequent conversation about racism because it doesn't exist. I mean, the antidote to not having that conversation is essentially asking people to look in the community and see how diverse it is, right? And I think that shuts down conversation right then and there, right? That people can actually actively pursue a conversation of actually critiquing and calling to attention the ways in which racism manifests within the community, because to do so is to then subject yourself to the possibility of people saying, well, look around you, like, you got, this particular group here, you got this particular group here. What are you complaining about, right? So I think multiculturalism hides really, really neatly the ability of people to be able to talk honestly and intentionally about racism, right? That's what it does. And that's also the beauty of whiteness and white supremacy, is that they're everywhere, but nowhere, right? And I think for us to be able to continuously challenge that kind of mythology, I think is really, really important and central to the work of actually uncovering and also identifying racism wherever they manifest within the community.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more strongly. And I think that's, just from my own personal and professional experience over the years, that's been the struggle for myself, trying to make space as a gay man of color who has experienced a lot of racism and a lot of discrimination over the years. But, I really think like the concept of being gaslit is so apt for this, because, it's everywhere, but it's nowhere at the same time. And I think, what you're saying about how the construct of multiculturalism really prevents us from having this open and honest conversation, which is not just it's not just about a conversation. It's about the impacts on us individually as gay men of color, as queer and trans people of color. And, I think just it's such a reminder of the need to disrupt that idea and to speak more plainly about our experience as people of color, as racialized folks who are subjected to ongoing and structural experiences of racism. So thank you. I couldn't agree more strongly. We've sort of touched on this a couple different points. So Dr. Giwa, I want to give you an opportunity to unpack this a little bit, but I know that a major focus of your book is talking about the coping strategies amongst gay men of color. And so, I just want to allow you an opportunity to speak to that aspect of the book and the research that you've done to our audience today.
Awesome. Thanks so much again for that, Michael. So without giving too much away, because the whole intention of this gathering is really to promote the book and to encourage everyone to go buy the book, right? So I think what I'm going to do is give sort of like an eye-level overview of some of the key findings from the book. So when we are talking about the ways in which gay men of color actually cope with racism, we can actually on a micro level just say that they use and they cope with racism using emotion kind of engagement coping strategies, or also problem-focused coping strategies. But what I found as I was analyzing the data and writing up the book was that it was too neat to be able to just couch the experiences of gay men of color within just those two paradigms of emotion-focused coping strategies and also problem-focused or problem engagement coping strategies. And what actually ended up happening was that I broke those two categories further down into emotion-focused engagement coping strategy, emotion-focused disengagement coping strategy, and then also problem-focused engagement coping, and also problem-focused disengagement coping. So in each of those, emotion problem, there is an engagement strategy that people were using, and there were also disengagement strategies that people were using, which I think is really important. And so when we're talking about emotion-focused engagement coping strategies, these are sort of coping efforts that focus on the individual's emotional reaction to a stressful event or situation. So in this case, racism. So when people are using emotion as a way to emotion-focused coping strategies, they're really just sort of like releasing and expressing their emotions. They are also seeking emotional support from others, be it family members, friends, or professionals who can actually support them in navigating those particular feelings and emotions that they have related to that particular phenomenon. So that's really what emotion-focused engagement coping was looking like. It was really more about the individual's emotional reaction to that stressful event, and then also some of the ways in which they sought to address that issue, i.e. seeking out support from family members or even affinity groups, spaces, or other ways that people manifested or actualized those experiences. And then when we're thinking about emotion-focused disengagement coping strategies, these are coping efforts that involve emotional distancing and shutting off of one's feelings from others, right? So in these situations, we have people not necessarily expressing feelings to others. They have a tendency to also want to self-blame for what happened to them. So rather than putting the onus and responsibility onto the perpetrator, they're actually taking all of that in themselves. And so when we're thinking about, when sometimes you hear this phrase of like, racism getting under the skin, that's one of the things that happens, through these self-blaming processes that we begin to, take on and assume responsibility for the actual perpetration of racism that is directed towards us. Being overly self-critical and also hard on oneself is just another way in which emotion-focused disengagement actually manifests itself among the men that I was speaking with. And then also when we're thinking about the problem-focused engagement coping strategies, these are often cognitive, but also behavioral efforts that are focused on the stressful event itself. So you will recall that in the emotional piece, it's really just about managing one's emotional state. It doesn't really involve any actualization of pushback per se in terms of confronting the person that is perpetrating the racism. It's really more about the individual and how they're actually internalizing and working through the emotional state that they're feeling in relationship to the racism. So in the cognitive state, in the problem-focused engagement coping strategy, so we got this kind of like cognitive behavioral kind of efforts that are happening where people are using the behavioral strategies as a way to eliminate the source of the stress, right? Or they're actually doing cognitive kind of restructuring strategies to change the meaning of the stressful situation so that it's seen as being less threatening to themselves. So there's actually some activities that is happening as a way to begin to redirect the feelings of racism that is being directed towards one, so that we can actually begin to manage it, and so that it doesn't have the kind of effect that it would normally have. We begin to address it through cognitive restructuring or behavioral efforts that we can manifest to be able to push against that. So that's how that problem-focused engagement happens. And then the flip side of that is the problem-focused disengagement coping. So again, these are still cognitive and behavioral efforts that are dealing with the stressful event, but here we have, rather than actually confronting, which we will have seen with the problem-focused engagement coping, here we're actually seeing gay men of color denying the, sometimes they deny the experience as a way of coping with it. It doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't racism or that they actually didn't experience racism, but as a way of coping with it, they would deny that experience actually took place, or avoiding to talk about racism, or avoiding to recognize that racism actually occurred. And then we also have this inability or reluctance to see things differently. So again, part of that process is that people are actually trying to reconfigure the meaning of the experience of racism that they've been subjected to in a way that will allow them to be able to still maintain a sense of sense of self and sense of identity, notwithstanding some of the conditions that has been perpetrated against them. So that's really it in a nutshell in terms of the high level overview of the different coping strategies that people were using. And that's how I describe them within the book. But again, if you buy the book, you'll be able to get more details in terms of how all of this kind of unfolded in terms of the experiences and the stories that the men shared with me.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Giwa. I just wanted to add a very quick comment too, and kind of putting my nursing hat on of my consumption of research is to inform an evidence-based practice, right? How can I give my clients credible and reliable information? And I want to acknowledge Dr. Giwa, particularly in chapter 3 and chapter 5 of the book. I think all of us who are in this health and wellness sector understand systemic determinants of health, how they impact particularly those at intersection. I think what we haven't done is brought a language to how that impacts people at the intersection and how they address it, both negatively, positively, and neutrally. And I think this book really does such a great job of that. And I think, you know, if from a practitioner standpoint, it gives a lot of food for thought in a lot of ways to provide resources and giving cross-cultural care in ways that can be effective.
Absolutely. And also too, I feel like I'll be remiss not to make this point. So even the overview the high level overview that I just provided in terms of the different coping strategies that folks were using, I think that, you know, some of the audience members might be wondering, so then does that mean that using problem-focused engagement strategy is better than emotion-focused? That was not really what the output of the study actually demonstrated. It's not to say that emotion is worse than problem focus or that problem focus is better than using emotion. In fact, what I found in the study was that depending on the situations that people found themselves in, different strategies were called for, and they made sense for that individual as they were, you know, grappling with the particular scenario or experiences that they've been subjected to. So I think it's important, if you're taking anything away from here, is just to recognize that there is vast kind of responses that people leverage as a way to respond to experiences of racism. And the two core ones that I found in the study that I did were really focused around emotion and also problem-focused kind of engagement strategies. So again, it's not either or, but and.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giwa, for offering what I think is a very accessible overview of a very practical typology in thinking about how we cope as gay men of color to a variety of experiences of racism. And I really do appreciate this point that you just made, or response to this question of, you know, are some coping strategies better than others, you know, and thinking about the different kinds of situations that we find ourselves in, including situations that have varying level of safety for that person, given the environmental sort of circumstances that that person may be dealing with. I think, you know, I really appreciate that point that, you know, or that simple sort of point around different strategies are called for based on, you know, the varying kinds of situations that we find ourselves in. And I'm finding it very easy for myself to locate myself in this typology of sort of thinking on this matrix of, like, you know, problem and emotion, engagement and disengagement. It is, I think, a really helpful way of thinking through some situations that I have found myself in over the years. Like, why did I respond like that? You know, like, what was going on for me then, or situationally, what was happening then that sort of led me to dealing with internalizing or not internalizing what was happening. And I think, just if I can offer maybe a bit of personal sort of insight or reflection around this. I mean, I think one thing that I would say is that it's hard to engage in, depending on where the kinds of situations that we're in, different coping mechanisms are more accessible to us than others, right? You know, and I think one just sort of basic thing is our place in relation to our environment. And, you know, when we're the only queer person of color in an organization or on a team or in a group, how challenging it is to give voice and to address the situation head on. And in some ways, it just becomes a lot easier to disengage, you know, and, you know, I think sometimes we can apply a normative lens to, you know, questions around coping, like, oh, that kind of coping is healthier than others. And we can make value judgments on the ways in which, I mean, like, that's what we do to ourselves, right? Like, we judge ourselves and each other on how we are responding to our own experiences of harm, you know, and which is unfortunate, I think. But it's something that I think I'm just reflecting on, thinking about this, you know, like the varied ways of you know, thinking about how we cope and how we respond. So thank you. Having like a million thoughts and reflections about this as a result of, you know, this very helpful way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I just wanted to quickly say something about that too, Michael. I think your point is well taken and very, very well said. And I think one thing that I will add is that even for the gay men of color that I interviewed and you know, work with, even, you know, again, as I said, like, you know, I think we have to be careful not to be saying that one coping style is better than the other, right? Because again, depending on the circumstances and the experiences that people are living in, that's going to dictate also the ways in which they choose to cope, right? But I think ultimately at the end of the day, what I heard participants also articulating is that emotion focus, like if we're just looking at emotion as a concept itself, without breaking it down into, you know, disengagement, engagement, or just looking at emotion focused coping, this was something that a lot of the participants stated that they used when they perceived less control over the perceived racist stigma. So they felt that they could not do anything about it. So the only recourse they felt themselves as having was to really have to deal with it internally. Like, you know, them have to do the work of emotionally managing their responses to those situations. And then similarly, folks also articulated the idea that problem-focused coping was utilized where there was a perceived greater control over the situation, that they actually felt themselves having control of it, that they can actually speak up and do something or push back, right? So I think that, yeah, we as practitioners, we as researchers, we as individuals definitely need to be mindful of not pathologizing and not stigmatizing ourselves or putting ourselves into pigeonholes to say, well, you coping with like this is really, really bad, like, you know, you should be doing this. Like, you know, because again, we need to take into consideration the variability of people's lived experiences and the ways in which they are, you know, the typology of coping strategies that they choose to leverage, because in that particular moment, that might make the most sense for that individual. And who are we to be saying that's not a good way for you to be coping, right? So absolutely, I take your point.
Thank you, Dr. Giwa. Yeah, you're really speaking to me on a level that you have no idea. So I really appreciate that. Robert, so as mentioned before, you know, we've known and had the opportunity to work together for several years now. So I'm curious from your perspective, how you think a book like this, unpacking experiences and harm from racism among gay men of color, as well as, you know, what we just sort of talked through, coping and responding to racism. How do you think this book informs CBRC's work, generally speaking, which is, you know, to strengthen the health and well-being of us LGBTQ+ people in Canada? So just really welcome any sort of thoughts that you might have around that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question. One of the points, Michael, that will be a repeat for you. We had the luxury of being on a panel at the International AIDS Conference a few weeks ago and was looking at health equity for us LGBTQ plus folks. And that point that I made, which, I will die on this hill, Canada refuses to keep aggregated and race-based data for health metrics. So we can't really talk about equity because we don't know what the inequities are, and overlapping with our previous conversation about how multiculturalism, this mass limits these conversations. So in thinking about an organization at CBRC that is attempting to collect data so that we can have data-driven activities, as well as how that overflows into culturally competent interventions and resources. And one of the reasons that we see a lack of that across Canada, why we see a lack of that in Ottawa, is because that's what, living in a procedural, bureaucratic place like Canada, particularly in Ottawa, how the government impacts the way we interact with each other. That's what we don't have as gay men of color, as queer folks of color. We don't have the data to say, this is what's happening to us, this is the impacts of racism, and this is what we need in order to become healthier and reach equity that's so talked about. And that's what is so powerful about this book, is it unpacks and addresses all of those needs. And I know we've collaborated with the BGMN earlier with, we looked at the data for Black gay men in Ontario, comparing that with other national and provincial data in comparison to other groups, which was really powerful and really, really enlightening. And so, CBRC and looking at Dr. Giwa's book, how that can inform research, making it more culturally safe for folks to access, because I know oftentimes that's a barrier to research because of the trauma. Particularly when it comes to research, racialized gay men don't participate. So, we're often underrepresented when it comes to data. So it fills in a lot of gaps and a lot of conversations that CBRC is having and looking at nationally addressing health equity for all queer folks, and certainly locally here in Ottawa.
Thanks so much, Robert. I mean, I'm glad that you brought up that point from our other panel in Montreal a few weeks ago, just because I do think that it connects with the theme of Dr. Giwa's book so nicely. And I remember speaking a lot about, this needs to be data driven, and how central that is to guiding our work. But it's hard to be confident about being data-driven when you don't have access or don't have confidence in the data that you have, that it's actually reflective of the communities that we're a part of. And so I really appreciated your contributions on that panel and what you spoke to, in terms of just calling out the lack of disaggregated data for racialized communities in general, and just this need to be critical in the way that we approach research, and to not necessarily be naive into thinking that, we publish a survey, we collect a bunch of responses, and that's our that's our community. And remembering the ways in which our data, our process to doing research and collecting data is maybe not reaching all the right folks, and thinking critically about how structural racism in Canadian society, within queer communities, how all of that actually shapes, something like trying to collect data from a diversity of people in our communities. And so I think, books like this and opportunities to talk through challenging topics where there's so much pressure to not talk about these topics is such a powerful, important thing to disrupt the ways in which that's happening, to challenge the ways in which the dominant discourse around race and multiculturalism and experiences of racism, how do we actually even engage with these experiences? And, Dr. Giwa, I want to turn to you as the author of the book, of course, I don't know if you have any insights in terms of how you think your research connects with CBRC's work. If you have anything that you wanted to build on this idea of like, not just CBRC, but all like queer and trans community organizations, how do we learn from this? And what are some insights that we could be applying into our practice?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for that question, Michael. And I think also in answering that question, I might be able to pivot to discussion around some of the, I guess, recommendations and implications for practice as well. So I will just combine those two things. But I think picking up on some of the things that Robert spoke to earlier, and to your question around how we can leverage some of the findings from this research to be able to inform the work that we're doing, I actually really see the, like if you think about, your acronym CBRC, the community-based aspect of it, I think amplifying that in the work that we do is really, really important. So this is one of the first, studies that I know that were done in Ottawa focused on gay men of color and trying to understand their lived experiences of racism. And I think that, and it was really community-based kind of rooted research, where it wasn't a case of just going in and trying to just collect data and don't have any kind of connection or any sort of, responsibility back to the community in terms of sharing the findings and making sure that the findings are being applied in practice in a way that would advance and also benefits the men in the study. So I think it's really, really important that the work we undertake needs to be really, really grounded and rooted in community-based work, and that we are intentional in wanting to shine light on some of the issues and the struggles, but also the resiliency and the ways in which gay men of color also thrive, right? So we don't necessarily want to focus too much on deficit, but also amplify some of the strength base that they bring to their lived experiences. I think that's really, really important. And I think that was something that came out strongly in the words, in the experiences and in the sharing that the men communicated to me as I was speaking with them. So I think for whether it's CBRC or being in another context, I think it's just important that we are able to listen, able to hear, and then able to then apply what it is that we've learned to improve people's lives. And one of the ways we can do that is by making sure that we are addressing the issue head on, that we are not subsuming the topic of racism or any other topic that might be the issue at hand, subsuming it under something else with the intention of maybe getting to it as a subtopic. So one of the things that I would suggest is that if we are really intentional in truly wanting to understand the experiences of people who are gay men of color, who are racialized men of color, and vis-a-vis the experience of racism, we should be intentional in our focus on that topic. That should be the topic of the agenda, and that it should not be taken over by something else that makes it, makes the topic of racism becomes less sort of a priority when it rather should be the priority or the focus of the issue. So that's what I would suggest. And then I think also when we're thinking about the implications of practice, particularly from the research that I did, I think that there is the piece around lack of informal systems of support for coping with racism. And I think this still continues to be the case in terms of how do we improve the competence of practitioners to be able to then meet the needs of gay men of color who are speaking to, everyday reality for themselves, right? I think also to expanding the scope of practice to include services that also addresses the stressful impact of racism is also important. So even here, as somebody that works in the field of social work, I'm asking the question of, how do service providers, when they engage or when they have clients come to them around, experience of racism, are we doing any sort of intake assessment that actually takes into considerations lived experiences of racism? And if not, what can we be doing differently to make sure that that becomes a point of assessment for possible intervention, right? I think that those are kind of the critical questions that we need to be asking ourselves in terms of the ways in which we practice or don't practice that is affirming and also strength focused. I think also advocating for resources to better support the creation of informal support systems by and for gay men of color is also really, really important, similar to K1 as we have in Ottawa. But I think we need to spread this across cities and towns in Canada to make sure that we are actually providing the kind of resources and supports that gay men of color truly needs in terms of creating communities of care for themselves. And here I'm going to borrow from Chimamanda Adichie, who talks a lot about the danger of a single story. And I think that similarly, I think when we think about the gay men's community, this single story is something that is also very prevalent. And I think we need to, again, begin to intervene and demystify that single story, that the story that we're telling is actually not the full picture of the experiences of gay men of color. And we need to do better in terms of telling our stories and our narratives, right? So this emphasis on disease prevention versus kind of like holistic wellness, I think is the sort of conversation we need to be actively having. And I also see a part and a role for CBRC in that conversation in terms of wanting to focus more on the holistic piece rather than amplifying the disease focus. Again, I'm not here to say that we should, forget HIV/AIDS. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that in addition to that conversation that we're having around HIV/AIDS, how can we also diversify that conversation so that it also begins to amplify all the other aspects and elements of gay men's lives, gay men of color's lives in a way that is enriching, in a way that is affirming, and in a way that presents their humanity first. And then I would also say diversification of evidence-based scholarship is also needed, right? As I alluded to earlier, a lot of the entry and gateway into this conversation around racism has really been couched within the conversation of HIV/AIDS. And we really need to untangle that, right? That's not to say that, particularly when we're thinking about intersectionality and how that connects to HIV/AIDS, absolutely, we need to make those connections. But I think just strictly focusing on HIV/AIDS as only the entryway for having this conversation is also very limiting. And we need to be doing a better job of making sure that if, again, we want to talk about racism and we want to talk about the impact of racism on gay men of color, then let's have a conversation about that. And I think in the general sense of gay men of color, what can they be doing? Some of the things that came out from the research without diverging too much information is really about this idea of educating themselves and taking responsibility and accountability to educate themselves around these issues, that the onus and responsibility should not be on gay men of color to continuously educate gay white men about their own racism, right? And I think, and this was actually a wonderful intervention at one of the events that we hosted in Ottawa related to the book launch, where one of the community rep also members indicated that in addition to accountability for white gay men in terms of on the individual level, there also needs to be this kind of collective accountability among white gay men, that when they are on, let's say, dating sites as an example, and you come across language like, no Asians or no Black or whatever, those are moments of intervention that white gay men can actually take up on themselves to say, you know what, this is unacceptable, right? And I think if they do that amongst themselves in terms of checking in or calling out, then that kind of takes away responsibility from the person of color to be able to stepping in and doing that kind of work. So, and I thought that was a brilliant intervention in terms of making sure that we're not just focusing on the individual level, but also we're looking at community collective accountability that needs to go along with that.
Oh my goodness, there was so much there, Dr. Giwa. I wanted to stop you
So
at least 4 or 5 times just to ensure that there'd be time to sort of respond to and engage with what you were saying there, because there really is so much. I mean, just to offer a few sort of thoughts from me, it's hard to choose. I'm looking at my notes. I'm like, where do I even start? I will just say, like, just on what you spoke to last, I think this idea, this concept of collective accountability, of allyship amongst gay white men to show up for gay men of color, I think is so important. But it's also something that I feel is in some ways an encouraging development over when I think about my life, when I think about like my entry into the gay community, I think there was almost this element of like, it was almost socially acceptable to be racist, towards towards other gay folks, no blacks, no Asians, no fats, no femmes. That was literally like all across the board, when when I think about my earliest experiences going online, right? And I think that's now changing. It's now at least become socially unacceptable to be overtly racist, when we're online. But I think that's like maybe a point of optimism, and thinking about where we're going from here. And maybe if I can connect that with some of what you were saying about the pitfalls of, a deficit-based approach, I think, and the linkages in talking about racism with, the opportunities that are afforded by HIV and AIDS work, which, as you rightly point out, it's not irrelevant, but why is that all constantly the point of entry for having discussions on the impacts of racism in our communities? I mean, I think being more centered on ourselves as people, as a community, I think is something that we're only just starting to do more of. And I think, this call to create more space to talk about racism and experiences of that, and to not dilute it by making it about something else. Like, I think so much of the conversations about racism in my work in HIV has often just, artificially drawn a connection between the two, and not really creating space or opportunity to sort of explore it more broadly in the lives of, like, gay men of color ourselves. So yeah, I just wanted to offer a couple of different sort of reactions and reflections to what you were saying, but I think amplifying the community-based aspect of what we do is so important for us at CBRC. But I think all community-based organizations really need to be sort of thinking about this.
There was just excuse me there, Michael. There was just a comment in the chat. I guess I'm technically challenged. I was trying to respond to Colin's comment there, but I think that it didn't go through. But essentially, Colin was just making the point that coping mechanisms also include drugs, subjects not spoken within our communities. And my response was that, this is so true, because even in the study that I did and also represented in the book, this was also strategies that people also refer to in terms of coping, ways that they cope with racism. And while not all of the participants stated that they use those as strategies, I think that part of it is because of what Colin is actually referring to in terms of this is sort of like a taboo conversation within our community, that we actually don't want to talk about the fact that we're using alcohol, we're using drugs as a way of coping. Because again, the impression that it might give people is to say, well, if we think about the, all the different typologies of coping you could be using, drinking alcohol might not be one of the ways in which we can say that we're actively or effectively coping with something like a problem. So, but for the participants in the book, this is one of the ways in which they actually coped, and for them it made sense in the instances that when they were using it. So I just wanted to acknowledge Colin's point around that, and to say that that came out in my study as well too, and is also captured in the book.
Yeah. I just wanted to briefly just send apologies to everyone who's attending the webinar. I do need to step out a few minutes early. Unfortunately, work does not stop. But I just wanted to share my gratitude to the CBRC for allowing this webinar to happen. Dr. Giwa and I have had a great time sharing this book. I'm going to try to have it with me. My background's a little blurred. I have all my notes. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. Everyone should read it, and I've enjoyed it. But I just wanted to respond very briefly. There was a question here in our Q&A chat, which is, why do we have so many organizations in Ottawa providing service to Black folks, and yet you cannot see any Black staff working in these organizations or boards? Very valid question, and it really speaks to how white supremacy works, right? It doesn't, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, white supremacy is embedded in everywhere we look. So I think it's one of two challenges in which an opportunity, remember my partner, who happens to be white, was working for an organization, and he had asked my insight of like, how can he improve relations with racialized folks? And I was like, are you willing to give up your spot? Are you willing to step down? Are you willing to empower a racialized person? Not just, you know, helping them take that position, but supporting them and making sure that they're safe, advocating for them, speaking up when they are dealing with racist attacks, whatnot. So I think it really speaks to a lot of recommendations that are in the book. How do we actively address racism for white people? And then on the flip side, one of the things that came out a lot is how for racialized folks, you know, the lack of mentors. And I think for racialized folks who are in positions of power, it's very important for us to be visibly and active in the community, as difficult as that can be, so that folks have representation and that we're also providing those insights and coping mechanisms.
Thank you so much, Robert. And I'm really glad that you were able to circle back to George's question about that. And I really appreciate your response there. I mean, I also think, just to build on what you're saying, it's so important that those that are able to, that have access to resources and spaces and time and capacity to support our peers, gay men of color around us who have, you know, a need for support, a need for someone to listen, someone who can sort of be in their corner, you know, in terms of how to create space for ourselves as gay men of color. And Robert, I thank you so much for joining today's webinar and for participating in the panel. We really appreciate all of your contributions to today's discussion. And sorry, you have to duck out a little bit early. But yeah, I mean, Colin, I'm just seeing your comments here. I think it's such an important point, and something that I don't think that we can ever really forget, you know, losing so many of our mentors in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. I think many of us who are in this work have felt like there haven't been people to help guide us, to coach us through different experiences. You know, when I showed up to work for CBRC almost 20 years ago, there were no, you know, there were no racialized guys that were around my age, role models that were sort of in positions of influence, who had established themselves. And I think that was, I didn't even realize what kind of impact that had on me. But, you know, reflecting on this now, like, it's not to say that I haven't sort of benefited from the work of really inspirational queer researchers, activists, who have helped pave the way for the work that we're doing now. But I think in general, like, it was a real struggle to find, you know, someone who could relate to our experience, who could help guide us and coach us and support us through, you know, through this work of trying to create space for people who continue to experience racism. So I think, you know, your point is super well taken, Colin. Thank you for offering that. Sulaimon, I know that we're almost near the end of our time, but I wanted to just invite you to offer a reaction to Colin's point. And I know that there was you wanted to close off with a brief reading, so I'll pass it over to you now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael. I think that your response was very thoughtful, and in the interest of time, I think I would just leave it there. I think that you've pretty much captured much of my sentiment as well, too, in terms of just the lack of mentorship, role models that we did lose as a result of the AIDS epidemic. But I think that we are recognizing that. I think, and knowing what we know now, I think it becomes a question of how do we then do better, right? And I think part of all of the works that we're all collectively doing is wrapped in that we're trying to activate our community in a way that they will begin to focus on issues that are impacting on not just racialized gay men, not just Black gay men of color, not just South Asian gay men of color, but all of us, right? Because we are all implicated in this kind of oppression that we're in. So racism doesn't just impact gay men of color, it impacts white gay men as well too. So I think that if we think about it from that lens, then we can be committed collectively and implicated collectively in the work that is required to be able to begin to eradicate it in our communities. So I think what I would like to then do now is pivot into providing a closing reading from the book, which I think speaks well to the concept of coping that we've been talking about. But the gay men of color in this study demonstrated that coping strategies are dynamic, reflecting the heterogeneity between and within their groups. While they alluded to particular strategies they found helpful or not helpful in responding to or reducing the stress of racism, their account also suggests the importance of context-specific factors. That is, coping strategies that might work for one person may not work for another person, and are shaped in part by the social, cultural, and environmental context of the racist events. This insight is helpful in tempering any rush to dismiss certain coping strategies as inferior to other coping strategies. Moreover, the men's narratives are a study in mental, emotional, social, and physical resilience. Regardless of the racism they endured, they found ways to respond to racist indignities through recourse to problem and emotion-focused coping strategies. Of course, as the men themselves observed, these strategies served particular purposes in their ability to deal with difficult racist situations. This remained true despite their understanding that specific coping strategies might yield different and sometimes unanticipated outcomes. Ultimately, the men's choices of coping strategies were not isolated, but influenced by and rooted in a foundation of personal, social, and cultural histories and vulnerabilities. Importantly, their awareness of the present revealed what was missing, lost, and exposed in their relationship and need for relationship with others from their own cultural group. With this awareness also came the understanding that formal and informal support could form important elements of the care cascade for gay men of color in helping them to cope with their experiences of racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Giwa, for closing out with that passage. And I mean, I just can't say it strongly enough how helpful I think this framing, this matrix of coping strategies and mechanisms, I think is so helpful for me. So I just want to thank you again for talking, sharing a bit about your book. I do think that there's still a lot more that we're probably all wanting to dig into. So I'm just dropping the link to the book. Please do check it out. Dr. Giwa, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. Robert, I assume you're not here, but thank you as well for being a part of this discussion. And thanks to everyone who turned out to hear and participate in this conversation today. We hope to do more events like this. And so really appreciate any feedback that you're able to provide. Yeah, I think we're just about at time. So we'll close it off for today. Thank you again, Robert and Dr. Giwa.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.